All right, everyone, if we could take our seats. It's approaching 12:05. We need to get this event on the road so we can get all this wonderful knowledge out here and then on to your next classes. Really want to thank you all for coming. I'm Richard Benson, the president of the Federalist Society here at Mauer, and I want to first of all thank our co-sponsoring organizations, the Pro Bono Immigration Project, as well as the International Law Society. And feel free to continue partaking of the food. We have a lot of good Mediterranean food for you here today that fits our topic and event theme overall. So as you know in the news, there has been for years now a crisis involving the Syrian civil war that has recently become even worse when it comes to mass migration, and has triggered lots of different issues when it comes to politics and the way people see other groups of people in the world. So we figured for our international focused event for the Federalist Society this semester, we would focus on the Syrian refugee crisis and also bring in the practicality component. So we can talk about both what's going on in the world, what's going on in the world of the law, and what's going on here in Indiana. So with that, we have a wonderful panel who decided to come here and spend their time with you today. And the plan of today's event is Ambassador Reese will talk for about 20 minutes, Professor Water for about 10 to 15, and then Director Varga will complete our panel here. And if we're lucky, we'll have 5 to 10 minutes for questions and answers at the end. Please feel free to think and write down your questions. I'll pass around the mic at the end of the event. So I'd like to introduce the panel to you, first of all, and I'll do it in reverse speaking order. And let's see, that'll start here with Cole Varga, who has an absolutely amazing job, and we're thankful that he drove down from Indianapolis for this event today. He is the Director of Operations at the Exodus Refugee Immigration Incorporated. It's an Indianapolis nonprofit that helps resettle refugees from all over the world, and he'll probably explain the State Department works with charities whenever they need to resettle people on the ground who have a lot of expertise in the area, and he's in charge of that for the Indianapolis area. Cole was a bachelor's degree he holds a bachelor's degree from this institution and got a master's degree in international relations from the University of Indianapolis in 2010. In addition to his role at Exodus, he teaches world regional geography as an adjunct instructor in history and political science at the University of Indianapolis. Let's please welcome Cole Varga. And our second speaker today is going to be Professor Waters, an absolute gem here at Mauer. In addition to being the assistant director for the Center for Constitutional Democracy, he has done amazing research when it comes to the area of human rights, has a large involvement when it comes to the Yugoslav trials during the 90s. Waters served as a consultant on the legal system reform for Open Society Institute, the UNDP, the Latvian Ministry of Justice, on ethnic discrimination for Human Rights Watch, and as a consultant to the defense on Padilla et al. If you remember our cases, we did read Padilla. He monitored the implementation of the Dayton Peace Accords in Bosnia for the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, and at the Yugoslav War Crimes Tribunal, he helped draft the indictment of Slobodan Milosevic. He was a Peace Corps volunteer in Hungary before he became a law professor, where he developed his interest in the regulation of minority-majority conflicts. During several research fellowships at Harvard Law School and graduate studies at Columbia School of International and Public Affairs, Waters explored the interaction of law and ethnic conflict. He also has studied at the Lund University in Sweden, the Boğaziçi University in Turkey, and visited Boston University, University of Mississippi, Bard College, and the Central European University in Budapest. His expertise is very much appreciated today. Let's please welcome Professor Tim Waters. And as our guest who came a long way here is retired Ambassador Grover Joseph Reese, who is a native of my home state of Louisiana and was the first ambassador to East Timor from 2002 and 2006 and has a world of knowledge when it comes to refugee law and the practicalities on the ground, especially in Southeast Asia. From 2006 to 2009, Ambassador Reese served as a special representative for social issues in the U.S. Department of State, responsible for promoting human dignity, including issues affecting vulnerable persons in the family within the United Nations system. He served as acting U.S. representative to the UN Economic and Social Council during the fall 2007 session of the UN General Assembly, and also served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Organizations. Before his ambassadorship from 1995 to 2002, Reese was senior staff member on the Foreign Affairs Committee of the United States House of Representatives, where he was responsible for human rights and refugee protection and played a major role in the drafting and enactment of important human rights legislation, including the Trafficking Victims Victims Protection Act, the International Religious Freedom Act, and the Torture Victims Relief Act. All important things you will learn about in immigration law for sure. Reese also served as the General Counsel for the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service from 91 to 93, Chief Justice of the Court of American Samoa from 86 to 91, and Special Counsel of the Attorney General of the United States from 85 to 86. He was a law clerk on the Louisiana Supreme Court for then Justice Albert Tate Jr. from 78 to 79, and press secretary to Representative David Treen in 73. Prior to entering his work in Washington, Ambassador Reese worked for 7 years as a law professor at the University of Texas at Austin, pretty darn good school. He has written and spoken widely on constitutional law, international law, and related issues. He received his bachelor's degree from Yale and his law degree from Louisiana State University School of Law, where he was editor-in-chief of Law Review. We are extremely blessed for his presence today. Please welcome our first speaker on the panel today, Ambassador Grover Joseph Reese.
Thank you. I think you're the first person who ever said everything that I put on my little bio. I'm going to have to learn to send shorter ones, I guess, but thank you. I want to talk a little bit first about refugee law and policy in general, particularly to distinguish it from immigration law. Then I want to talk about the part of refugee law and policy that has to do with resettling refugees. And then I want to put those in the context of the current crisis. You know, every American lawyer, every lawyer I know anyway, believes when they get a case, there's always a question of, am I the right lawyer to handle this case, or do I need to bring somebody in, an expert to work on the case? And I find that almost invariably, after thinking about that important question, every lawyer believes that he or she is indeed the best lawyer to work on the case, with 3 exceptions. If the case involves, they need to find an outside expert if the case involves tax law, immigration law, or Louisiana law. And as a Louisiana lawyer who has worked on immigration law, that makes me happy. And if I ever got a tax case, I would hire an expert. Immigration law is complex. It is all, it's got layer on layer on layer of fixing problems that went before. And sometimes you fix the problems in one direction and then you find that you overfixed them and you go back and you fix them in the other direction. But they never start from scratch. They always add layers of complexity. It's very complex. And the other thing about immigration law is it's primarily about what's good for the United States. We are the most generous country in the world, historically and today, in terms of how many immigrants we admit. But we do that primarily because we think it's good for our society. And therefore, the categories of immigrations we admit and the categories of immigrations we don't admit are calculated, who's going to do well in our society? Who does our economy need? Who does our society need for other reasons? Refugee law, although you find it in the same section of the U.S. Code as you find immigration law, is very different in both of those respects. First of all, it's not very complex at all, and I'll talk a little bit about just what it says. But it's the simplest part of immigration law. There are really only 2 or 3 principles you need to learn in order to understand refugee law. And second, it's not about what's good for the United States. It's based on a moral imperative that no matter who it is, or almost no matter who it is, you don't put people back in harm's way. You do not willingly subject them to serious risks of being killed or of having other serious harms. Refugee law only becomes important in the case of an individual if that person doesn't pass the immigration test. Because if somebody is already admissible as an immigrant to the United States, then he or she doesn't come as a refugee, they come as an immigrant. So the only people we admit as refugees, whether it's for asylum, people who are already here and who apply for asylum, or whether it's the question of whether we pick somebody from somewhere else in the world and resettle them, it's somebody who wouldn't otherwise qualify to immigrate. So through that complex system we have that says what we think is good for the United States, we make an exception. We say, even though this person might not pass those tests, we're going to let him in because we just can't stand the idea of what's going to happen to him if he goes back or she goes back to where he or she came from. Refugee law came into being as a body of law after World War II. And if you really had to say what it's about, what we decided, we, the 146 nations who ratified the Refugee Convention and the Refugee Protocol in 1951 and 1967, and then the United States in our Refugee Act of 1980, we basically decided that we were never going to let a particular thing happen again. And that thing is the voyage of a ship called the St. Louis. It wasn't the only one, but it was the most famous one. There was a ship in the early 1940s, it might have been 1939, but I think it was the early 1940s, that left Europe with several hundred Jews from various countries in Europe, and they had Cuban visas. They had visas to enter Cuba. And those were real visas. They were legal visas, but they had been fraudulently obtained. There was a corrupt consular official. Well, sometime, by the time that ship got to Havana, the Cuban government knew about it, and they rejected those people. They wouldn't let the ship land. They wouldn't let any of the people board and come into Cuba. And so the ship went to Miami, and they asked to be able to unload their passengers in Miami, and it went all the way up to President Roosevelt. And they didn't fit in our immigration system, and we had ways of making humanitarian exceptions, but it was deemed that it wasn't a good idea because you might get lots of other ships if you let that happen. So we didn't admit them. And then they went up to Canada, and they steamed down the St. Lawrence to Montreal, and they tried to get the people admitted in Montreal, and Canada also turned them down. And so the ship sailed back to Europe, and the people went back to Europe, and about half of them died in the Holocaust. And that became a very famous case. There was a movie about it, a book about it, Voyage of the Damned. And we decided that that was never going to happen again. So when you're considering a question of who we should admit or not admit as a refugee, or whether we should adopt a particular rule limiting refugee admissions, a good test to apply is what I call the St. Louis test, which if that law or that policy would enable you to send back the people on the St. Louis, then it's probably not consistent with the basic principles of refugee law. Unfortunately, we regularly consider laws and policies like that. The core obligation of nations who agree to the Refugee Convention, and the core obligation imposed on ourselves by the Refugee Act, is called NonRefoulement. And it means if somebody's a refugee, that is if he or she has a well-founded fear of persecution on the ground of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or something called membership in a social group, a particular social group, which pretty much means something a lot like those other four things. And we're not going to send them to a place where they would face a likelihood of persecution. And a likelihood doesn't mean 51%. It means any reasonable fear of persecution. And we're not going to send them back to any place where they're then going to be sent back to the place where they will face persecution. One thing that the Refugee Convention does not impose, and that our law does not impose, is an obligation to resettle refugees. You have an obligation not to send them back to persecution if you've got them, but if you're not the country of first asylum, if you're not the place they landed, you don't have an obligation to go to Turkey and pick up a bunch of Syrian refugees. You don't, and bring them to your country. You don't have an obligation to go to camps in Thailand and Malaysia, as we did in the 1980s and 1990s, and pick up hundreds of thousands of Indo-Chinese refugees. That is a policy that we have adopted for a couple of reasons. One, many of the non-signatories, there are 146 signatories to the Refugee Convention. That means there are 50 or 60 countries that haven't signed it. Many of those include important first asylum countries. Thailand has not ratified. Malaysia hasn't ratified. Indonesia hasn't ratified. So a lot of the times when you have these people who've managed to escape, there are other countries like China that have ratified but don't pay much attention. They send people back to North Korea with some regularity. So what we worry about as a country who's decided that it's pro-refugee is we worry that if we don't accept them in the United States, that Thailand, Malaysia, these other countries are not going to just let them stay there indefinitely. Eventually, they will be refooled. They will be sent back to persecution. There's also just a sense that the nations of the world should share burdens. It shouldn't be a geographical accident if there's a genuine refugee crisis. So the United States, so about 20 countries in the world do a lot of resettlement. And the United States does about 2/3 of all the resettlement that's done. Now, it's not a particularly large number. Generally, the UNHCR estimates in any given year that there are anywhere between about 12 and 20 million refugees. UNHCR is UN High Commissioner for Refugees. And they estimate that there are between 12 and 20 million, depending what year it is. And in any given year, about 70,000 or 80,000 people get resettled all over the world. And about 2/3 of those are in the United States. The last few years, it's been 45, 50,000 that we've resettled a year. We have a quota for resettlement which is higher than that, which is 70,000. And we typically accept 70,000 a year, but then we've got a lot of security clearances and stuff that have to be done. And so in the end, probably only about 50,000 resettle in a year. Now suddenly we've got a big crisis. We've got 4 million people who have been deemed what they call prima facie refugees by the UNHCR, people from Syria. And it's prima facie means they haven't had a chance to interview them, but based on where they come from and based on what little is known about them, there's a good chance that they would face persecution if they went back to Syria, or at least back to the part of Syria where they came from. So suddenly there are 4 million, and we see calls by well-intentioned human rights groups in the United States saying, well, we've got to accept at least half of those 4 million. We've got to accept 2 million. And then you have equally astonished and irritated entreaties on the other side saying, oh, so you want to take 2 million terrorists. And so that's pretty much the stage of the debate. Well, I wanted to clarify with a few facts. First of all, well, a few things that people claim to be facts anyway. The United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees, who knows as much as anybody about these people, estimate that about 400,000 of them will need to be resettled. Now, what's going to happen to the other 3.6 million? Well, some are going to turn out not really to be refugees. When things sort out a little bit in Syria, even if they don't sort out very well, a lot of those people may be able to go back to parts of Syria that are controlled by their faction. Others are in places like Lebanon, Jordan, where they have family, where they have friends, where there may be members of their religious or ethnic community that are willing to accept them, so they may not need to be resettled in a third country. I think the UNHCR is estimating low, but they're estimating 400,000. And they believe that over the next few years it would be a good idea if the United States would take half of those people. Well, right now we're not even close. The administration has announced that they will increase our refugee resettlement quota by 8,000 to 10,000. They haven't promised that all of those will come from Syria. There is, by the way, another big, but not as big, refugee crisis going in Southeast Asia, where we have probably about 100,000 Muslim Rohingyas of that ethnic minority being primarily from Burma. And Burma doesn't want them, and none of the other countries in the region want them, and a lot of them have been pushed back in boats. A lot of them have wound up in Aceh, Indonesia, where they are accepting them. But those people are going to have to be resettled. So it's not just the Syrians, and that may be part of what we're going to do with our 8,000 to 10,000 new. Now, the question is, could we do better? Could we accept, let's say, 30,000 a year or 40,000 a year, so that over the next 5 years we could accept half of those 400,000? Now, as a matter of numbers, I think the answer is clearly yes. Right now, we have a quota of 70,000. Between 1980 and 1994 or so, it was 100 to 150,000 every year. That was when we were letting in a lot of Indo-Chinese and a lot of ex-Soviet Jews and other ex-Soviet refugees. When those programs ended, and sometimes they ended with extreme prejudice, a lot of Vietnamese, when we got compassion fatigue, simply got sent back to Vietnam. There had been some economic reforms, and therefore, of course, the human rights situation had improved, and some of those people are suffering to this day. When that program ended, they didn't find new groups to admit. They just kept the number at about half of what it had been before. Senator Sam Brownback, a conservative Republican who's pro-immigrant and pro-refugee, was chairman of the Senate Immigration Committee for a while in the late 1990s, and former senator. Now he's the governor of Kansas. And when the State Department presented their 70,000 number to him, he said, "Why is it only 70,000? We could take 70,000 in Kansas alone." And the head of resettlement for the State Department at the time, bless her heart, told Senator Brownback that he didn't know what he was talking about. It was a great exchange. So yes, we could take way more than 70,000. It would still be a tiny fraction of the people who come legally. We admit about 1 million people legally to the United States. But what about these particular people? What about the people who think that if you take people from Syria, no matter how hard you try, you're going to get a bunch of terrorists? Well, as you may have perceived by now, I tend to be pro-immigration, and I tend to think that the anti-immigration people are mostly wrong. And I have to remember, as a Catholic, that the same things that are being said about Muslim immigrants today were said about Catholic immigrants in the 19th century. They could not possibly assimilate into the United States because they're going to do what the Pope says, and that's inconsistent with being a citizen in a republic. So you have to remember that however scary a group may seem today, they didn't seem any scarier than my great-grandparents did. That doesn't mean they're necessarily always wrong. What if we admit 400,000 and only 1,000 of them turn out to be people who are sympathetic to the idea of jihad in the United States? Is that a risk we're prepared to take? I think there are a couple of answers to this. One is that we do have a lot of systems in place to try to weed people out like that. Maybe we need to get better with them. Maybe it means we can't be quite as quick as we'd like to be. A second answer is that I don't think that there will be debate in the refugee advocacy community about this, but I don't think that it's necessarily illegitimate when you're accepting people to bring to the United States. This is not a question of kicking people out, but when you're picking who to bring, I don't think it's wrong to prioritize people who we know don't hate us. I think it's okay to prioritize groups, particularly when you're trying to do something very quick. There are Christian refugees in Syria who are particularly vulnerable. Many of them are not even making it into the UNHCR process because they're scared to be in the camps. The camps are dominated by people who they think are the people who were persecuting them before. So they tend to be in villages in Lebanon. We could be looking harder for those people. Kurds who are Muslims but who have never, who have tended to be on what we regard as the right side of history, constitute about 15% of the people in the camps. And so if we were looking for people to resettle quickly, where with our security procedures in place, we know there would be a very low risk of admitting people that would cause trouble for us, we could be looking at Kurds. We could be looking at people who are members of known groups who we refer to as the moderate opposition in Syria. We could probably get 30,000 of those people while we sorted out the algorithms of what we needed to check for the other 170,000 people that we wanted. But here's another thing to remember. right after September 11th, for about a year, we didn't admit any refugees at all because we were trying to sort out what we needed to do to make sure we didn't get any terrorists. And I was working in Congress at the time, and a bunch of people from refugee organizations came to my office and said, can't you get your administration, I was a Republican, the Bush administration was in office, can't you persuade them to start up the refugee program again? And I'd actually spoken to them that morning, and I reported cheerfully to the groups that don't worry, we're going to start again, we just want to make sure we're going to get everything in place, but we're going to start again and we're going to get back to the 70,000 number. I've been assured it's going to happen. And one of the refugee advocates said to me, well, you know, I accept what you're saying, but I just want to remind you of one thing. During the year that we have admitted no refugees because we're afraid some of them might be terrorists, we've admitted hundreds of people into the United States to go to flight school. So all we're asking is that we be no more restrictive on refugees than we are on legal immigrants who have big companies wanting them to come in. And I think that's part of the answer on the Syrian refugee crisis. We need to be careful, but we have ways of being careful. We're admitting immigrants from those places. We're giving people tourist visas from those places. And so if we can do that safely, we can probably also admit significantly more refugees from those places than we're admitting now. Thank you.
Thank you for those excellent, extremely thoughtful comments, and in many ways quite uplifting. I'm going to take a somewhat contrary approach to that, I think you'll see. So when I was thinking about what to say today, I came across something that Adam Smith wrote in the Theory of Moral Sentiments, and this is what he said. If a man would lose his little finger tomorrow, he would not sleep tonight, but provided he never saw them, he will snore with the most profound security over the ruin of 100 million of his brethren. I think this is a profound and bleak truth about humanity, and anyone contemplating the running sore of the Syrian European refugee crisis would do quite well to remember it. In a sense, the only thing that Smith gets wrong is the thing about seeing, because you could in fact Google pictures of a young Kurdish boy, very photogenically washed up on the Turkish coast. You can find pictures of people bobbing in the ocean, thousands of them in the Aegean and the Mediterranean. But observing this suffering of others doesn't actually ensure loss of sleep or an effective response. And I fear it is not in our nature and certainly not in our system to do otherwise. This is not a message we would like to hear, but sometimes in the academy, our purpose is not to see the world, is to see the world as it is and not necessarily to propose remaking it. So I'm not going to end with some handy list of 3 things we can all do to fix the refugee problem. In a sense, it's not a problem we can fix because the problem is the system. It is predicated upon proximity, on self-defined obligations and self-interest, and we are, in a sense, simply seeing it work. So let's just consider some of the contours of this crisis. The ambassador has already outlined some of this. But a war in Syria has displaced millions of people, and hundreds of thousands of them, along with Afghans, Eritreans, and lots of other people, are making their way to Europe across the Mediterranean, up the same Balkan valleys that have been used by armies and migrants for millennia. A lot of them are heading for the north, right? The wealthy north, Germany, Sweden. And it's this migration and European states' very clumsy responses, right? Opening borders, closing them, stringing up barbed wire fences, shooting tear gas, throwing food. All of this has triggered a political crisis in Europe. But when did this become a crisis, right? While those millions were languishing for 4 years in Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey, and inside Syria itself, or when they began arriving in Italy and Greece and Hungary? The current flow is large, but it's also a kind of rich man's problem, right? European Union leaders had to struggle to distribute 120,000 refugees. But it's clear, much along the lines that the ambassador said, 500,000, 1 million in a continent as large and wealthy as Europe is objectively manageable. This is a crisis not because of the refugees, but because of Europe and its design, the Schengen system, which allows borderless travel inside a zone and therefore defeats the efforts to have country-based policies, is a design that, much like the euro, is not really able to bear the weight of hard events. Right? This is a flaw in EU governance, but it's not a flaw in the refugee system. Under international law, as we already heard outlined to some degree, countries do have obligations to offer asylum, but as the ambassador rightly said, this means in the place of first refuge. And in fact, states, including signatories to the convention, regularly, in effect, expel applicants, people who could be, if they had a realistic opportunity to register somewhere else. And so this is why, right, we see refugees off the Syrian coast destroying their documents. They understand how this system works. When we see migrants without documents crying Germany as they march up the roads, they're not just fleeing danger, they're seeking the best possible life, right, in a wealthy, stable place. That's sensible, that's a human reaction. But it's also something the system is not actually designed to give them. And I would argue not inclined to give them, because states only have the obligations that they choose to have. That's actually part of the system too. As the ambassador mentioned, right, this system is a function of international law. It rests on the 51 Refugee Convention and on its protocol. So let's just think how that works for some of the main countries at the front lines of this crisis. Jordan and Lebanon aren't even parties to the convention. Turkey is, but it actually maintains the original 1951 convention obligation to receive refugees from Europe, not from anywhere else. So the poor states ringing Syria have no obligations under the convention, or they have obligations to a hypothetical wave of European refugees, while the wealthy European states are taking a fraction of the burden. And of course, if we look elsewhere, to the Gulf, for example, wealthy countries have taken almost no one. And of course, there are tens of millions more refugees. The flow we see now in Europe is actually just the spillover from a standing pool of human suffering. The system is the creature of states seeking to do something humanitarian, but without contradicting their own interests. It's I think, much in the way you described US policy. It does serve our interests, and it is also a humanitarian impulse. So the system works this way because the governance of our globe works this way. The academic world that many of us are working in has in some sense become besotted with visions of a post-national world of hybridity, polycentrism, and decentralized networks. It's all the rage. But a hybrid polycentric network is not necessarily a very pretty thing, in the way a hydra is not pretty. The marks of a multicephalous system are auto-interpretation, everyone deciding for himself what his obligations are, self-dealing and ox-goring, right? Always coordinating but never deciding. Global governance is not global government. The more we chase the chimera of a shared global society, the more we have to acknowledge that in some real sense, there really is not an international legal order. It makes me wonder why I teach international law, actually. But without centralized institutions of decision-making, without a world government, for which there are many reasons why we don't have it and perhaps shouldn't, this is the kind of regime we can expect to have. You can imagine better systems, but implementing them is much like the pacifist dream that if only every soldier would put down his gun, the war would end today. It's a beautiful idea full of pathos, but it's structurally implausible. It only happens at the end of wars, when demoralized and dispirited and defeated forces mutiny, when there is chaos, collapse, and desperate flight, much like a refugee crisis. So this is the system we have, and we are not likely to make a much better one. Improvement, when it comes, is likely to mean more effective border control, like the enormous ring forts circling Spain's enclaves on the African coast, or its highly effective shore patrols to keep boats away from the Canary Islands, or the enormously effective system that Australia has put in place to keep refugees from its shores altogether. As for the human beings trapped in this system, we can do some things. The impossibility of more than marginal reform means we should focus on the margins, accepting more refugees for asylum, giving more funding to UNHCR, which is terribly overstretched, thinking more about alleviating the suffering of internally displaced people, because this is in fact in most conflicts the largest group, not those who manage to get out, but they, though they are not technically refugees, suffer just as profoundly. So these are the things we can do. That's the takeaway. But it's clearly a palliative. It's proffering a bandage. It's not providing a real haven. And that bandage is the system too, a way of making life marginally less miserable in the permanent camps. So this crisis is real. It's now getting dark in the Aegean, and very soon rubber rafts will be pushing off from the Turkish shore, overloaded, their motors failing, some of them adrift. Some will make it, but others will sink, and those on board will die. But this crisis is also normal, and the ocean is very wide, so you can sleep well tonight. You can see it all on the news tomorrow.
Hello. Thank you very much for having me today, for the invitation to come speak. I'm going to talk a little bit about the local resettlement. Coming from Exodus Refugee Immigration in Indianapolis, we're a local nonprofit agency, and we are responsible for resettling about 900 refugees a year in Indianapolis. We're one of 3 agencies in Indiana that does this locally. There's another one in Indy that does about 500. This is through the Catholic Church. There's another one in Fort Wayne. I don't know which way I'm pointing right now, but north of Indy in Fort Wayne, that has about 200, 300 refugees there. So about 1,600 primary resettlements in Indiana each year. These 3 sites are part of a network of about 300 plus agencies throughout the U.S. There's 49 of the 50 states do resettlement in the manner that Exodus does. Wyoming's the only exception, and I think they're looking into it very soon. I'm not sure why they're behind. And about 189 cities that accept refugees through the State Department's resettlement program. So those numbers put together, I guess you can already see with 70,000, as the ambassador mentioned, 70,000 refugees a year coming to the U.S., this number going up to 85,000 this year, at least projected to. You can see why you'd want to spread that number out across the country, right? With those 900 in Indianapolis, what we try to do as a nonprofit is pretty much wrap around the social services for the first 3 to 6 months, although our mandate allows us to work with people for up to 5 years. That 5-year mark comes because that's the time when refugees would be able to gain citizenship. So through the refugee program, you have a protected status as a refugee, which is a permanent immigration status in the U.S. After 1 year, you're eligible for green card residency, and then 5 years citizenship if you pass the test. Just aside from that, as this is part of the small legal thing I can actually talk about to a group of lawyers here, or future lawyers, I'd say citizenship is actually one area where we're trying to ramp up our efforts to get people ready for the test, ready for the things that go along with citizenship. So there's actually a lot of grants floating around. I've noticed over the past couple of years a national interest in preparing people to get ready for citizenship. One thing that's the biggest barrier I would say to that is English. One of the programs I oversee at Exodus is the English class department. We have 3 full-time teachers on staff, and you can only do so much in the first couple of months, and then of course you lose refugees to jobs, to work, because they have to support their families, pay the rent. But then there comes a time a little bit later when you get close to that 5-year mark, and now there seems to be this pressure of, we really need to get ready for this, for the citizenship test, and people start coming back to English classes. So pardon the digression to immigration status there. So anyway, why Indianapolis as a resettlement city? I think I mentioned already that you kind of want to spread the 70,000 around the country, but I think Indianapolis in particular, and Indiana in general, is a very good place for refugees to wind up. Cost of living, of course, is probably the first thing that comes to mind. So I did an average of our rent payments. We help people pay rent for the first few months when they get here through State Department and private funds. And it's about $696 for a month of rent. This could be 1 bedroom to 4 bedrooms roughly. And I was speaking on the phone to someone in Fort Lauderdale yesterday who said their rent was $1,600, which is just crazy to me to have the same amount of money entering as a refugee and it going 2 or 3 times as far in a city like Indianapolis compared to Florida, Miami, Fort Lauderdale area. So I think initially you have a much better chance of success in in Indianapolis than many other places in the U.S. Other cities might be similar. Chattanooga, for example, Grand Rapids has resettlement. Those would have maybe comparable living standards. But also I looked at our wages, and we're a bit behind nationally, I'd say, but for entry-level work, I think it's still worth bringing up. I've seen the wage go up a couple of dollars in the past few years for entry-level refugee looking for their first job in the U.S. So currently we're at about $10 on average, $10 an hour. And for someone who might not have ever worked before, for someone who has no work experience in the U.S., might have been a subsistence farmer before in their homeland. That's $10 an hour, and your first job is significant. I made 6-something in my first job, right, in high school. But nonetheless, $10 is not a lot for someone coming from a different family structure, a family where you might have brothers and sisters and aunts and uncles all living with you. So with recent families we've had coming from DR Congo, Somalia, the family size tends to be a lot bigger, 8, 9, 10, and supporting a household on $10 is very difficult, to say the least. Now, refugees are eligible for temporary assistance for needy families, cash assistance, welfare, if you will, as well as SNAP, formerly food stamps. But those only go so far, and actually Indiana's been tightening the screws on these benefits recently. So in terms of our populations, I'll mention this a little bit. Syria, of course, is the one in the news, the one we're all kind of concerned about at the moment, especially with the European crisis. The U.S. has only brought in about 1,800 Syrians, which is virtually nothing compared to what Europe's seeing, what the numbers of resettlement actually should be, as the ambassador mentioned earlier. So about 1,800 in the past year and a half, roughly. Indianapolis is one of the first sites that received Syrian refugees, and we've had the overwhelming number of 25 Syrians come to Indianapolis, which is very sad because we actually would like to tap into this feeling of excitement that the community's had, that you all have from just having this event today, right? People want to help. We get calls every day. It's almost overwhelming sometimes, like, hi, I'm volunteer with the church and we want to help Syrian refugees. What can we do? And basically we have to tell them, sit tight because we can't help them either. There's only a handful here. But what we try to do is pivot them to our other groups because you alluded to a couple of them already. DR Congo, huge humanitarian crisis that's been ongoing since the mid-90s. Burma, liberalizing, as they're saying, but not necessarily with human rights at the time. So we still have many, many Burmese refugees coming to Indianapolis. Eritrea, another one that's sort of getting lost by the overwhelming number of Syrians, but Eritreans are also fleeing to Europe right now. This is on the northeast coast of Africa. And then some Iraqis and Afghanis as well that we work with. Some refugees, some holders of special immigrant visas, SIV status, which would have been, for example, interpreters that worked with the U.S. Forces in Iraq and Afghanistan, and then their families were targeted, so they're granted a special status. So these are on top of the refugee numbers each year. Burma overwhelmingly is what Indiana's, I guess, famous for in the network. Fort Wayne, in the early 2000s, about 10 years ago, ramped up Burmese resettlement quite a bit and had about 10,000 Burmese living in Fort Wayne, relatively medium to small size city, very quickly. And their kind of community was overwhelmed. They didn't have some things in place for infrastructure to handle refugees. So schools, for example, health department, doctors. So they slowed down a bit, but have ramped up a little bit more recently. Indianapolis has seen similar numbers and actually has overtaken Fort Wayne as one of the primary, if not the primary, Burmese refugee site in Indiana, or excuse me, in the U.S. We have roughly 10 or 12,000 Burmese on the south side of town, another couple thousand on the north side of Indianapolis. Many of them from the Chin ethnic group, which is along the western border with India. This group's well established now, and I think what we're seeing is something that is a really good argument for resettlement, and that is localized revitalization of a community. So there's better examples of this. I think people point to Dayton and Toledo, I think, as having some of this revitalization efforts due directly to refugee resettlement, where a new group will move into town, inhabit lower income or developed or unloved areas, and bring in new jobs, new stores, new businesses. So on the south side, we have what's essentially Little Burma at this time, 7 restaurants and grocery stores, Burmese insurance agent, Burmese mechanic, Burmese car salesman, and it's really not that it was that much decline on the south side, but it has certainly generated a spark with this new younger population, especially, that's eager to work because they've had the opportunity for the first time. So I would mark this as a success for resettlement on the south side of Indianapolis. Sustainability for refugees, roughly, 90% of our jobs in terms of sustaining their families are mostly warehouse jobs. And this is another reason why I think Indianapolis is a good site for refugee resettlement. The crossroads of America, if you will, tend to have a lot of plants for truck driving, for shipping. So we have a lot of people with OHL, UPS. Amazon has, I think, 5, maybe 6 warehouses now around the Indianapolis area. So a lot of, we call them pick and pack jobs, tend to work out really well for someone who has limited English but can read characters and do sorting. So it's been crucial to have these jobs to sustain new workers in the refugee community. I think overall, I'd just like to maybe say to you guys as you're moving on to your careers, what we can do for refugees is continue to advocate, as the previous speakers had mentioned, to continue to advocate for an increase in resettlement, because 70,000, if we're the world leader in the U.S. In terms of resettlement countries at 70,000, and yet only about 1% of the world's refugees are being resettled globally, I think we can do better, and we can point to examples like Indianapolis, like Dayton, as reasons for increasing resettlement. Thanks.
I know there are a couple licensed attorneys for CLE credit. We do have that form in the back before you leave. And we still have about 10 minutes for questions, if anyone would like to ask any questions of the panel at all. It's being recorded, so we ask that you use the mic.
I have a friend in Canada. They recently received a lot of refugees, but as she said, a lot of refugees are just live on the benefits. They have very high social benefits, like higher than the pension. So they don't like to work because that is enough for them to have a very enjoyable life. So is that a problem for America? Like how much benefits they get, and does that discourage their incentive to work? Thank you.
Well, the good news and the bad news is the benefits aren't that high in America. There are countries, I don't think Canada's one of them, but in the Nordic countries, there's a period where they get very high benefits and they're not allowed to work. And I guess they're worried about, taking Swedish jobs or something. But our program is designed, and I'm sure Mr. Varga will want to say something about this, to integrate people into the society as productive members of society as quickly as possible. And, is there long-term welfare use among refugees and immigrants? Yes, but it's lower than among Native Americans, among people who were born here.
Yeah, as he mentioned, the benefits are tiny. So, for example, a single male might get food stamps in the amount of $150 a month, which is not enough really to feed an adult person for a month in many cases. And in general, that hasn't been my experience at all working with refugees, and specifically working with employable refugees. They're incredibly motivated to work because they've never had the opportunity before in many cases, or if they did work, it was often by looking over their shoulder. So people fleeing from Burma to Malaysia, for example, wouldn't have had legal rights as workers in Malaysia, and often would have been targeted for dangerous jobs or working under the table. So it's really not been my experience, and I think especially those that have kids, which is, I think, a main driver of why someone would want to resettle in the U.S. to make a better life for their families, as often is the case for many immigrants. They want to start working right away to give their kids the American dream, right?
One of the things that I've read about the Syrian refugees going into Europe is that a large percentage, maybe a third, are professionals, so doctors, lawyers, engineers, teachers. What kind of refugees are we bringing into the United States? Is it like comparable, I guess, to that, or are we really bringing like really, really poor people, or is it just a spectrum?
Yeah, I'll take that one as well. I think it is a spectrum, and it really depends on the country. So Burma, for example, is mostly people coming from lower income, rural, ethnic communities on the border of the country. So we'll get a doctor, lawyer once in a while, but mostly, entry-level background of work. Syria, you're right. I think there's a lot of engineers, doctors, lawyers, professionals, but also shopkeepers. So it's difficult in a different way for us, because if you're coming from a country where you were a doctor, to come here and not speak English and not be able to practice medicine is a huge blow to your, to yourself, everything you've worked up to. So kind of another hit after being forced out of your country. I don't know if you guys...
Mr. Ambassador, you mentioned a woman and the story that you told. Was that a specific woman, or?
You mean the person who told the senator he didn't know what he was talking about?
Yes, sir.
Yes, unfortunately, I mean, she wasn't the only one, but yeah, I worked in the government more years than I planned to, and I remember having once to, people go to different jobs within the government for different reasons, and unfortunately, some of the people in our refugee bureau think that it's their job to guard our borders against refugees, and of course, some of my colleagues in INS felt the same way. But I was surprised because during the couple of years I was in INS, we'd have these big interagency meetings when we had the Haitian boat people and some Cuban boat people. And INS was taking the more forward-looking view against the State Department, who both had some of these people with the word refugee in their title who didn't much like refugees, and then some people who were concerned about what it was going to do to our bilateral relationships and so on and so forth. So yes, unfortunately, there was one person in charge of resettlement who didn't much like resettlement. That person has retired, but it is it's a problem. It's like consular officers. Unfortunately, consular officers, they might come into it idealistic and starry-eyed, but they get lied to a few times, and they round it off to 99%. It's like, we have once bitten, twice shy. Well, suppose you got bitten 5 times in your first year. You'd hate all dogs. And unfortunately, we have to retrain some of our consular officers to remember that mostly our job is to facilitate travel to the United States, not to turn it down.
My question's for Professor Waters. I was just wondering, is it from your perspective that taking on refugees should be seen as a charitable endeavor rather than actually solving the problem of refugees? And is it maybe used as a get-out card that by taking on refugees you're helping the global problem? Or is it simply just, alleviating suffering rather than helping the problem?
No, it's a good question, Mr. Boyle. I'd say, given the structure of the system we have, given the kinds of numbers of people who are resettled that the ambassador described in relation to the pool that's out there, and I think the only number I've heard different is many people estimate as many as 60 million people who are effectively refugees today in the world, the largest number since, even larger than right after the Second World War, although that was a much larger crisis.
60?
Yes, this is
I think
some
they're
credible
including other
IDPs as well.
yes, and other migrants for other reasons.
Yes,
I think.
and the IDPs, and I think I view it as legitimate to include them because they're functionally in the same situation. They just don't have the same legal status. So given those kinds of numbers, I think should we view it as a charitable exercise? I think what I would say is that that's in fact what it is. It is on the margins. It has the same kinds of qualities that charity has, both a humane gesture, but one that most people realize isn't actually a solution for social problems. And it looks like that. Yes, it's palliative, it's marginal, it is humanitarian, but not designed to actually fix the problem. So yeah.
I would say, by the way, that the problem is that fixing the problem is really hard and sometimes involves regime change, and we've gotten burned a couple of times on that.
I had a question for you, Mr. Ambassador, which was about you talked about prioritizing certain groups when we're looking at refugee status and who to bring in first. And you mentioned, for example, the Kurds or Syrian Christians. And I was wondering, even if there's not a technical legal problem with that sort of prioritization, doesn't judging based on ethnicity or religious background sort of violate some fundamental constitutional principles?
Well, if it does, our whole refugee resettlement program is in big trouble, at least on the ethnic part or the nationality part. I would never propose a binary religious test. As I said, people said about Catholics 100 years ago very similar things to things that people are saying about Muslim immigrants and refugees today. We've got about 6 million American Muslims. Most of them are doing great and are contributing to our society. I do think that when you are thinking about bringing any large group of people about whom we know very little into the United States, it's not illegitimate for people to say we need to be careful. And the more we know about somebody, the other thing is we do try to prioritize the most vulnerable people. And religious minorities, particularly in places that are dominated by people like ISIL, are especially vulnerable. I forgot to mention the Yazidis. How many Yazidis do you think we've admitted? I haven't been able to find the number, but 0 would not shock me. And there are thousands of Yazidi refugees in that group, most of them not in the camps for the same reasons that the Christians aren't in the camps. And we should be looking to resettle those people. I don't think we should exclude Muslims by any means, and of course the Kurds are overwhelmingly Muslim. But I do think that when you talk about groups, it goes back to even North Korea, when hundreds of thousands of people fled from North Korea to South Korea at the last moment when they could, in about 1950, the North Koreans salted a few thousand people in there to make sure that they'd be able to cause trouble later. I'm very proud of all the Vietnamese that we admitted to the United States, but we did bring in, along with all the hardworking, deserving people we have now, we brought in a couple hundred really nasty concentration camp guards, and we need to be really careful about that.
We have time for one more question. Let's thank our panelists one last time. thank everyone for coming. Our next event, enjoy your winter break and finals, will be on January 26th, where we have a criminal justice reform panel, ideas from all sides. Thanks.
Thank you. I enjoyed your remarks. I did have pictures of the Hydra chasing the Chimera.